Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a new edition of True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Jacqueline, and we have a very special guest tonight, Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. She is the pioneer of forensic genetic genealogy. She is also the founder of Identifinders International, which helps law enforcement and everybody else to try to identify human remains, missing persons, and suspects in violent crime. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Oh, anytime. I'm excited to speak with you. I had on Misty Gillis a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about Boy in the Box, which we're going to get into a little bit about today. But she told me you got to get Dr. Fitz on, and I want to do that. But there's some interesting news that just came out today. One of it is I got from your LinkedIn page. Actually, two things from your LinkedIn page. 23andMe looks like a judge has decided to sell 23andMe, not to Regeneron, which it knew, but also one of the co-founders of the original 23andMe. How did you feel about that when you heard the news?
Well, I felt a lot better than if the data was sold to somebody else not associated. If Anne Wojcicki is involved, I'm a little less concerned because she already knows the privacy policy. She knows the issues. So I felt it was better to have it still in her hands, somebody very knowledgeable and knows what the applications are, rather than another company that probably, either doesn't care or it doesn't know the details as well. So I feel a lot better. I myself have not removed my data. There was a lot of people that agreed to have their data used for research, and that's what I understand this is all about. So I'm not as concerned as I would have been otherwise.
Right. So privacy does matter, and I think that's what a lot of people were worried about, right? Because
Yeah.
there's only a couple of these sites that allow law enforcement use. 23andMe was one of them, correct?
No,
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 it's not.
it was only GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA were the only two. And those
Gotcha.
are relatively small databases compared to like 40 million or 30 million on Ancestry and maybe 15 million on 23andMe, something like that. But the ones we use are relatively small, so it makes what we do a lot harder than, say, a normal genealogist working on their family.
Gotcha. Yeah, I want to get into all that, but there was some other news about the National Technology Validation and Implementation Collaboration.
Mhm.
Oh, that's a mouthful, right? They
Yeah.
updated their forensic investigative guidelines. What,
Yeah.
so I did read it. It was sometimes a little difficult for me to understand because it's that real scientific stuff. But what is the basic takeaways that you got out of these new guidelines that come out?
Well, the basic takeaway is this: this FGG or FIGG is moving along. It's been a few years now. A lot of cases solved. People need to develop policy and procedures. You have to. You just can't let people. There's privacy versus public safety, and there's a big discussion. So there has to formulate some kind of suggestion, some kind of guidelines, some kind of best practices, that should be followed as suggestions. Of course, it's up to the individual jurisdictions to kind of make it work with their own jurisdictions, make it work. But as time went on and more cases were being solved, more agencies were using it, really there has to be some kind of discussion on how to structure it, not too much, but how to kind of get a pipeline going, And so we have two communities right now. We have the forensic community that's been around for a long time, and we have the forensic genetic genealogy community that's relatively new, at most 25. Genetic genealogy is 25 years old. Forensic genetic genealogy is more like 10, 15. So, you have one community, the forensic community, that's, highly regulated, and has matured, has, become more detailed. And you have the forensic genetic genealogy community, people that have never been really structured. That community is very diffuse, from people that type with one finger that are geniuses to people that solve cases like, stay on the case for 2 and 3 years. There's lots of different levels of talent. So it became necessary to try and kind of formulate a common ground, or, produce some way to go forward that's not chaotic, because this is people's privacy, it's people's safety. It's the judicial system. So that's the purpose of the committee, to try and get together, the leaders to get together and think through this.
Now, is this about regulating too what law enforcement agencies are doing? Because I'm concerned about law enforcement per se. Because like I said, when we get a new toy, we tend to break it.
Yeah.
and it's something I'm really concerned about. Is this something like this of this body would oversee something like that, and those
No,
guidelines would
no,
apply to them?
no. These are only suggestions, recommendations for policy, procedure, and best practice. That's all we're doing, and it would be up to the individual jurisdictions to kind of adapt. If they want take our suggestions, great. But to whatever they are, adapt it to what their needs are and what the laws in those jurisdictions are. So it's only guidelines. That's all it is.
What do you think is probably the most important aspect for law enforcement to think about as they go forward? What kind of guideline would you suggest, or would you think to try to prevent something bad from happening?
Well, there's a lot of people on this committee from a lot of different backgrounds and points of view, which is very good. So we're trying to come up, for example, with what cases? How do you triage cases? How do which case would qualify? How does it? You got to have the DNA, obviously. It's got to be a question of public safety, obviously, and then how do you decide which case to take priority? And how do you handle privacy versus public safety? What do you reveal to other people on the case, and what don't you reveal? You keep the names of matches private. So that's all kind of upfront, and so my two takeaways from my point of view are two. One, the accreditation of the practitioners, getting them sort of in a pipeline that everybody knows how to behave and what to do, best practices. And also data retention tends to be kind of an issue, because until now you have a genealogist basically with their own data on their own laptops. And yet you have the crime labs that have, a whole structure on how to retain data. And, so that if a crime lab has the data for a case for some reason, or a court has it, and that person leaves that has created that data, you can either bring them back, or there's a way to, I'm not an attorney, but if that person dies that has created that data, there's some way you can still introduce that into court. But all that data should be stored somewhere at the crime lab. But in genealogy land, we don't really have a lot of that all structured yet. So for me, that's very important, because I have data here. I work for so many agencies. It's not really formalized what I do with it. And I'd like to maintain it all together and be able to put it somewhere in case I go away, I die, I retire. It's a legacy that it can be used later.
Gotcha. Because like in the news right now, we had you probably have heard by now, Bryan Kohberger looks like he's taking a plea tomorrow. And one of the things that I was really interested in this case, and I was following it pretty closely, was the FBI and the investigative genetic genealogy that they used to help identify him as a
Mm-hmm.
suspect.
Mm-hmm.
What could you tell us about that? Because the defense was really raising a lot of questions about how it was done and what could be the potential problems with that.
Well, I think the problem was, I think it's not a secret. The FBI was using MyHeritage, which really was not keen on, let's put it this way, wasn't happy with having, forensic use of their database. So I think that's come to an end. But I think that, the defense wanted to get, even though that was an investigative lead, the defense wanted everything turned over in discovery, to find out how Mr. Kohberger was actually identified and tracked down. So, there was hesitation, let's say, to turn that over, because if the FBI if the FBI was doing that, then maybe, when you have a real serious case like this, what could cause a big, rift in the whole trial, what could cause a mistrial, what could cause something to go wrong. And, so I guess the prosecution really wasn't keen on turning that over. And then there was discovery issues coming up. That's what was going on.
Right. And unfortunately, we're never going to hear the result of what the decisions were and how they went about doing it, because once the plea goes through, there goes that
Yeah.
kind of information. I was actually kind of looking forward to that aspect, because I thought,
Yeah.
once you get something like this into court, you can get it okayed, things become a lot easier going forward. But
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
we'll
Yeah.
have to
And my
see.
question, I'd like to just say, it's all a puzzle to me, because this guy, let's say he allegedly, he committed these crimes. And to me, it would be see if he could outsmart the police or get away. It's sort of like my thought. I don't know. I don't read his mind. So, here he, thinks so he's smarter than the police or whatever, reason he had for doing this. And now he sort of says, okay, I give up. He's sort of something happened. And something happened in that whole decision process. And I'm curious to know what it was.
Yeah,
Was
me
it
too.
the prosecution offering it, or was it defense, or did they kind of come in the middle? How did that all happen? Something happened.
Yeah, there's lots of working parts that we probably will never know the exact story behind it, but we went from alternative suspects till okay, I did it. Pretty weird, and we're talking about a real short time frame too. We
Yeah.
only took like a week or two. We went from all
Yep.
this, so
Yep.
I don't know I don't know. I mean,
That beats me.
let's get into some of the historic cases because we said you're the pioneer in this. You actually did this first in the Sarah Yarborough case.
I did.
Yes, so congratulations on that. See, we don't get a chance to talk to the actual people a lot of times that actually do the work and did the cases. So this is actually kind of fascinating. Now, if I remember correctly, I did my homework, but it was the suspect was Fuller, right? And he dated him all the way back to the Mayflower. Is that the?
Yeah, that was initially. Now, in the early days, you got to understand this is really primitive, right? You use the Y DNA, and I use that to match against the genealogy databases to come up with a last name. That was the hot thing back then. So, believe it or not, I was falling asleep one night, and I said, the markers they use in forensics are the same ones they use in genealogy. I wonder if I took a cold case Y profile, compared it to the genealogy databases. So, went up to Phoenix. I was up in Seattle giving a talk at a conference, and I made an appointment with the Seattle Police Department, and they didn't really take very much to what I was telling them. But Jody Sass, who was a DNA analyst up there, she caught on, and she put me in touch with Jim Allen in the King County Sheriff's Office, and that started the story there. Now, at that time, I came up with the name Fuller. And now Fuller, the genealogists I'm actually matching, went back to the Fullers that were not on the Mayflower, but they were the same family. They came 10 years later. So Senator Robert Fuller. So we thought the name might be Fuller. And I want to say the genealogy community did not take too kindly to this, because this was like oh my God, the police are using my data, run for the hills. They're going to arrest me any day and interrogate me, with lights and starve me to death. I don't know. It was pretty rough. But anyway, the Fuller, the Fullers didn't pan out because there were half a dozen Fullers in the area. We had them tested, or one guy had moved to college in Mississippi, and nothing worked out. All right, so from that point on, that was 2011. We actually solved it, I think, in 2019 with the SNP testing. But I want to say between there and where we solved it, I tracked the development of the technology, because I tried to get SNP testing done 6 times because I realized the value. Now, when we did the Fuller part, it turned out she had a classmate named Elizabeth Fuller, one of 5 daughters. So a person of interest became their father, William Fuller. So we had William Fuller tested in CODIS. No, it wasn't him. However, he had the same Y chromosome as the killer, so he was a cousin. So we had the killer's genealogy going back to the Mayflower, and we had a male cousin, but we didn't know what generation. So from the beginning, I realized SNP testing might tell us the generation and the connection. And if they were like first or second cousins, I could do the genealogy and find out whoever was living in the area, hopefully. But so I did it 6 times. I went to 6 different chances. And the last one was when, we really it was after the revolution started, and we used the, FGG, and that solved it. But I want to say I never gave up, and I kept at it until the end, and we got it. The man's name was Patrick Nicholas because his grandfather had been adopted.
Wow. So, I mean, talk about twists and turns and all this. And this case you started doing this before Joseph D'Angelo and the Golden State Killers.
2011, 7 years. 7
Right.
years.
So,
yeah, Yeah, a long time ago. It was long, but it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't really popular. And the genealogists were very unhappy about the whole thing. And I mean, it's public data. What are you going to do? So I just kept, going to police departments here and there. It wasn't really, oh my God, this is a great company to have. No, it was more like, oh, I wonder if this is going to work. Oh, this is really cool. Let me try this again. And I kind of intuitively saw the potential of really helping people. I saw that it wasn't, business. It wasn't making tons of money. And in fact, it wasn't even publicity because, well, that brings us to the Phoenix Canal murders. And when that happened, and I gave the name Miller, within 20 minutes, they had Bryan Miller on the list there. But I want to say that what was I going to say? When the detective called me to say we got Bryan Miller, I mean, this was, oh my God, it was never had happened before. It was scary because the next thing he said that scared me to death was, whatever you do, don't talk to the media. And I was like, okay, I didn't plan to, but I get, we don't know how this is going to go. It's sort of like, so he said, we don't know what this means. Don't talk to the media. It scared me to death because, number one, they figured out who I was, and they figured out kind of what I probably did, but the media kept calling me. I had one journalist who, in fact, now I know I'm on good terms with, and I explained what was going on, but she called me every now and then, and finally it was like, I don't even want to answer the phone. I'm too scared. And then occasionally somebody would, one of the, forensic people would come up at a conference because it leaked that way too, because it happened when I was attending the International Symposium on Human Identification, ISHI, and ISHI found out about it. So they wanted to put it on their website I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
And then people in the A-list would come up to me and say, hey, I heard about the Phoenix Canal murders. What happened? And I'm like, what do I tell, this A-lister? I'm not supposed to talk about it. So I kind of maneuvered around the subject and let it go. That was scary. So it wasn't for money. It wasn't for publicity. It was just to see if it would work. And it did, finally.
Right. I guess probably from the Phoenix police point of view, it was probably going to be, a challenge in court, right, about how this was going to go, and they wanted to make sure that they were going to be able to pull this off, because as well as I do, admissibility of evidence and how they went about doing this is going to be like the key in solving a lot of these cases.
Well, I want to say that the CODIS match is what did it. They got a surreptitious sample from him, and they matched. That was what did it. Now, it was sort of had an interview really early on, and they said, "What'd you do?" I said, "I pushed a button, and Miller came up." What else? And what did you do after that? Nothing. I emailed the name. What'd you do? All I did was click in numbers, and it played a little bingo game, and I got that name, Miller. And so I wasn't called to trial or anything, because really it was an investigative lead that gave them a name that pointed them to that guy. And the detective told me a couple of things later. One detective told me they had been triaging. They had 2,000 people in the case file. And one detective was going from A to M, and the other one was going from N to Z, and triaging. And they would have never gotten to Miller. They were going to meet in the Miller. And the one detective said he had gotten as far as J. Oh, well. So we jumped the track. And another detective told me a few years later, he said, until then, the powers that be were not really spendthrifts. They were tight, and they didn't want to spend money on new technology. But once that happened and they saw it, then we began to get money for like cell phone tower dumps and geofencing, whatever at that time in 2011, 12, 13 was the new stuff. They started opening up and paying for some of that, maybe rapid DNA, So Phoenix is really forward looking. So is Washington State. I have to give them a lot of credit for that.
Right. And then we have the boy in the box case in Philadelphia.
Oh, the boy in the box, believe it or not, just won third place in the cold case hit of the year. the Gordon Thomas Honeywell. I didn't know that, duh. But the boy in the box was really interesting because, I want to emphasize the company I have. We do not just deal with centimorgans night and day. We actually, I'm really good at real bad DNA. The upfront. We really sit down and think through what the best strategy is for DNA where you have almost none and it's really in bad shape. Now, this case, it was almost none and really in bad shape. So I wound up over a period of over 2 years with Misty's help. She kind of hung in there with me to go to labs in 2 other countries. There were 3 countries involved. And in the end, I think the only people in the world that could have done it, really. And because of the interest that was taken in not just that case, but in the technology, we got a lot of it done. We got all of it done for nothing. I mean, basically nothing, because it was so, technically and research-wise interesting. So 3 years, 3 countries, and pulled it off just for free.
That must have been satisfying, right, when you found out the news about that case, because it's touched a lot of people's souls, basically.
Yeah. Well, the thing was, we were close. We had the family, and Mom had already put one kid up for adoption. We knew who she was. We had talked to her. Okay, she's adopted. And we thought, and she said, I think there was another kid. All right. So this was in COVID, and the real hard part was waiting. We wrote to the state archives. COVID, you just couldn't go over there. So the state archives was half-staffed, right, because of COVID. And they basically told us, sorry, you have to wait in line like everybody else. So it took months to get the birth certificates with Mom's name on it, and see what Dad's name, if Dad's name was on there. And so that was like, that was what did it. And in fact, there were 4 of us on the phone. Misty was one, and the detective and the lab guy. And I almost wrote down the time, the day, the year, the time, the place, because that was it. We got it. And the hard part was we had to keep our mouth shut until the Philadelphia Police Department decided to have the press conference, which took almost a year.
Right, which is frustrating beyond belief. But they were probably working the case, right, to see if they can come up with a suspect. They didn't want to maybe scare anybody. I don't know.
No, because when the boy dies in 1957, look, even if it's his parents, it's going to be an adult, right? So that adult's born in the 1930s. And if they're still around, they're going to be, almost 90.
Yeah.
So you say the chance of anybody, the chance. So it wasn't, it was just, again, balancing the privacy, kind of getting the right people to know at the right time, because, the minute somebody says, oh, yeah, let's have a press conference of Boy in the Box, immediately it's all over the internet, it's all gone. And I think the police wanted to very carefully vet, right, if there's anybody left on Earth that might know what happened, that was important. But also just because to keep it under their hats and do it right according to the chain of command.
Gotcha. What now there is a difference between maybe you can explain to us in simple terms the short tandem repeat, the STR, and the SNPs that you were talking about. Could you explain what they actually are and what they mean for all this?
I can absolutely do that. I give talks, and this is the deal. STR, short tandem repeat. The S stands for short. That means it has some length. It's a piece of real estate. It can be short, it can be long, right? It can be as short as maybe 150 positions. It can be thousands, but it's a piece of real estate. And law enforcement uses 20 pieces of real estate called CODIS markers. And there are 20 pieces of real estate scattered on the DNA. There's maybe one on each chromosome or almost every chromosome. And they use that as a legal form of identification. There's 20. And either you have a match, like you have DNA at a crime scene, get the CODIS profile. And then you have a suspect, you get his CODIS profile. Question is, does it match? It's yes or no. Some states give you a little wiggle room, but basically it's yes or no. So when you go over to genealogy, we use something called a SNP, an S and P. And the S stands for single. So it's a point. It's not a piece of real estate. It's a point. So we don't use 20. We use 1.2 million points. So now it's not, do I match or don't I? It's more like, how many points do I share with you? If you come up, you take a DNA test and I take a DNA test, and we share half of our SNPs, that means we share half of our DNA, and that means we have to be a parent-child combination. So you start to say, God, if I share less, if I only share 10% of those 1.2 million SNPs points, then 10%, let me look that up. That means I'm a first cousin-ish of yours. If I share less, I'm more distant. If I share more, I'm closer related. So if you look at that, that's what's bringing in genealogy, because when I get my results, it's not going to be, do I match the crime scene anymore? It's going to be, I'm going to have a whole list of people I match, sort of, from close to distant. So I have what the answer is. I get a list of DNA cousins. And say you don't know who I am, I'm Jane Doe, but you see family members. So you say, oh, that's their family. So I wonder if I can knit all this together and find out who they are, depending. It's like a big Sudoku puzzle, because if all those cousins are related to me, they're all related to each other. So that means that I can start building trees. I connect, and I get a Sudoku puzzle, because they all have to be consistent with each other. You don't even have to worry about me at first. You could really connect all those people to this puzzle so that horizontal, vertical, and diagonal, all consistent with each other. And in the end, there'll be one piece missing, and that's where I belong. Or that's where me and my siblings belong, because we all have the same genealogy. So that's basically how it works. You build all those trees and they connect into the big puzzle. Hopefully you'll get a nice tree and you can fit that guy in there. And actually, it's kind of more interesting, because when you build all this out, in the perfect case, you get two trees. You get two separate, and one's for mom and one's for dad, because all these people are related by blood, or they're related by marriage. So when you have, in the end, if you had 10, let's say 20 matches, 20 DNA cousins, 10 should be mom's side, ideally, 10 should be dad. So then you find one person in this tree married the other person in the other tree. One of their children is who you're looking for. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does actually. It says, so easy to understand the way she explained it. That's from Mission Woodside.
Thank
But
Mish.
So I guess when you only have the mitochondrial DNA, it presents a problem, or no?
Well, that's the mother's side. That can help, because there's a famous case out in Japan, the Setagaya case. It hasn't been solved. It's like 25 years old. Long story about Japan and how they handle things. But they do have the Y and they do have the mito. They have very small database, so don't worry about doing CODIS out there. It's another story. But they have the mito, and that is Caucasian European, and the Y is Asian. So you see, it gives you a clue, but it's not like you're building the tree out. You basically say the ethnic flavor of those two direct lines, complete maternal, complete paternal, but the mixed gender in the middle, can't do anything about.
Right, and that kind of presents problems going forward, right? Is
Yeah.
that like the biggest problem about for forensic genealogists?
Oh, well, there's lots of problems. Where do you want to start with all that?
Well,
you're
well,
building the
give me
trees.
which is the biggest problem for you guys?
Well, let's say I gave you a real easy example, because people out there want to know, right? The complications come in when, let's say, mom and dad might be related. Like they live in West. I want to tell you, everybody in West Virginia is related to everybody else in West Virginia. So if you get somebody from West Virginia, you're in for a real treat. You, because they're both related to they both had the same great grandmother, and so it's not like these two nice trees. It's more like a baobab that folds in on itself, and that you can't, like I said, if you have 10% of your DNA, your first cousin, okay, but if that DNA comes from more than one common ancestor, if you get that DNA from 3 or 4 different people, it becomes a very, messy thing to figure out, because you may not be a first cousin, you may be a third or fourth cousin, but it comes you have too much DNA.
I think that's the best politically way put it together for West Virginia, but that was pretty fun. There's a question for you. It says, what does Dr. Colleen think? What was the longest time she spent putting together a tree to help solve a crime or give a Doe back their name?
Let me say that sometimes what people, there's another part to that question, and that is up front when you work on the DNA, sometimes that takes a lot longer than the actual genealogy. And as an example of that, East Haven Jane Doe, that was from East Haven, Connecticut, 1972. Jane Doe found wrapped in a carpet behind a shopping center in a ditch. I'm telling you, you got to interview this detective, Joe Durgo out there. It's a crazy story. It took us 3 years to get the DNA, the right DNA, know where she was buried, exhume her, get the right DNA, and get it into GEDmatch. Her sister was right there. It took us less than 5 minutes to solve it with the genealogy. So it took 3 years for the DNA and 5 minutes for the genealogy. Now, in other cases, if you're asking just about genealogy, of course, Sarah Yarborough took 7 years, 8 years, right? But that was because technology had to develop, right? That wasn't building the tree. Probably the longest tree I worked on is probably 2 years, close to 2 years, and just keeping at it. And one of those, I had people working with me, or I worked with them, and I do remember one of the longest ones was a woman from West Virginia. And the problem was, the cousins kept coming up. No matter what we did, it's the same cousin again.
Gotcha. If you're just joining us now, we have Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, Identifinders International founder and pioneer of forensic genetic genealogy, with us, sharing her knowledge and some history that she's made in this field. And it's actually kind of interesting to talk to you about this. I just want to switch gears just a bit. I do want to get back into the forensic genealogy. A lot of people are interested in getting involved in this field, specifically some of my students at the criminal justice programs and many of what we refer to as our squad members right here in the chat room that are really interested in there. Is there any suggestions or advice that you would give somebody who might want to look to do this?
Yeah, there is. And I get contacted often, are we hiring? How do I get into this? That's a common question. So I do have some suggestions. Well, first, let me tell you reality. There are very few jobs in this space, very few. Now, independent people like myself or my crew, I'm really not counting like detectives that are working in an agency or something like that. I'm just talking about people that want to get involved. And I get emails from people saying, hey, I love genealogy. I've done my grandma's whole story back to the Mayflower. How do I get involved in this? And my answer is, well, first of all, be real, because there aren't any and very few jobs, and there are training classes out there, certificate programs that have turned out several hundred people each, or many hundreds. So the market for people that want to do this is very popular, very crowded, and there are almost no jobs. So the best way is, first of all, do as many hard adoption searches as you can. The harder, the better. You got to understand that if you're a regular genealogist, you're using Ancestry with 30 million people in it, right? And, chance of you getting good matches is good. We work kind of undercover. We work with GEDmatch and Family Tree. So we have maybe 1 million to 500 or 2 million people to work with instead of 30 million. So it's a lot harder. And also we can't reach out. We can't go, hey, I'm working on a violent offender case and kill this woman. You're his first cousin. Can you help me with that? No, you don't do that. So it's a lot harder. So you do the hardest adoption searches you can. But more importantly, if you really are serious, you should study something peripherally, related, like genetics or DNA, some kind of forensic DNA program. Because if I'm hiring somebody, I want somebody that's going to do more than send them organs, that, more than worked on their grandma's family tree yesterday. I want somebody who is more broader in scope and knows about DNA. And also, I'm going to advise that anybody really interested, go to the conferences, go to a forensic conference. There are too many people going to the genealogy conferences that think if I meet me or one of the other A-list there, I'll ask them and maybe they'll have a job opening. I'm really picky. I think everybody's really picky because the jobs are very scarce. And if I hire anybody, it's going to be somebody who knows more than send organs, who's really done some good work, has a good reputation, knows more about DNA. So if I talk to them, they'll get it, and has attended some of those conferences to have a broader point of view on many different areas in forensics, on odontology, isotope analysis, forensic anthropology, even legal aspects of what we do. So I tell people, really get in there and learn what to do mechanically. But more than that, go to conferences, go to AAFS, because that's the easiest conference to go in, and it's a smorgasbord, no matter what you're interested in. So learn other things. And if you're in the sciences, specialize in a peripheral area like DNA, genetics, or lab work, or become a DNA analyst. And you'd have more contact with the people that could use that, and you could kind of incorporate, when it was an opening, they would know who you were, they know what you're doing, and they would be more likely to bring you on the team. So I do have one other very important thing that is often neglected, and that is be very, very careful with social media. Part of the problems we have these days are, let's say we have two communities. We have the forensic community, and that is well established over the last hundreds of years. And we have the genealogy community, the genetic genealogy community that is 25 years old, and the forensic genetic genealogy community that's 10 or 15. So we have a very amorphous, unstructured, community, from people that type with one finger to rocket scientists that look at something and understand it. So, and it's like unregulated on everything. So there's been a lot of social media abuse. And so if you stay away from, not stay away, but be very careful. Don't, like on one website, it says, no, do not post, bad stuff about law enforcement. Don't criticize, something like that, which is very well intentioned. Like, let's keep it, nice, and don't start. But again, if you're called as an expert witness later and you say, don't say anything bad about law enforcement, that might be held against you in court. And you see, it's you wouldn't think about that if you were a genealogist. You would think about it if you were a law enforcement officer or attorney. You would not do that. But so if you want to get in this, be very, very judicious about how you use the social media and what you say. That's going to stay around forever.
Yeah, that's a message I tell my students all the time. So I tell them, don't post anything you wouldn't want the police, your mother, or a lawyer to see. Yeah, I mean, basically, that's it's a dangerous game. It's a dangerous people. A lot of the kids don't understand
it's that. It's pollution. It's just I've seen some very prominent genealogists basically, trash other genealogists. I've seen them post things that I know are not true. I know because I was either there or I happen to work with the same people, and I know what their policy is, and somebody's saying something else. Or confidential information that I know is right there on Facebook.
Right. Yeah, there's no need for that, and there's no place for that. But you can't stop certain people, and it is what it is at that point. But
Yeah.
is
Well, if you want to get, the subject is, how do you get a job in this industry, or how do you
right,
get work? That's one of the, you can't stop some people, but they won't get jobs in the industry.
right. That's something. Is
They
there
will be
any
stopped.
like now one of the things that when I was reading about you and learning about you, you're very tenacious, right? You were trying to get a book published,
Yeah.
and this was like there was a 2003. You were trying to get the book published
Yeah.
about what we're
Mhm.
talking about, right?
Yeah.
Tell us about what happened then.
Well, I had a rocket science company. I was a contractor for the Department of Defense and NASA and stuff. And it wasn't going well because we were with George Bush. We were in a big company era with aerospace in Iraq and oil companies. So we had decided to close our company, and I started working on a book kind of on the side called Forensic Genealogy. And it was meant as a hobby book. It was meant how to apply very simple science to your genealogy to get more out of it. And of course, now it's how to apply genealogy to science, which is kind of interesting switch there. And so I had it done, and and then I had a contract with a genealogy company to publish the book. But it took me a long time. It took me 3 years. So when I went to the genealogy company, I said, I have it done. They said they didn't want it anymore because it took me too long to write, and forensics was passé. It says I missed my chance. Okay. So when you devoted all my time, I was sitting there crying. I actually found another company that might have been interested, but I was just sitting there crying, thinking, book is done except for the editing, the cover, that last part. And I had a partner at the time who had worked for the UN for 30 years. He had worked for foreign governments of Iran, Nigeria, Malaysia. He had been 100 countries. So, and he was an engineering advisor. So he'd go into a factory and advise them how to make it more efficient. And if they didn't take his advice, it didn't matter. He just had a great job. Everybody liked him. So he had retired. He was my business partner. And he became my domestic partner later. So he saw me crying. He said, why don't we just publish it ourselves? And I said, we can't do that. And this was back in 2000, about 4 or 5. So this is really early on the internet. I said, we can't do that. Yes, he said, yes, we can. He said, I work for a book bindery in Nigeria, and it's not that hard. And that was like a Kodak moment. Book bindery, do they have books in Nigeria? Hey, wait a minute. And in that moment, it kind of came out that, yeah, why don't we just, we went to various printers and we did not upload it to the internet. We did it ourselves. We opened a publishing company. So we researched the cost, the size, how many words on a page, the font, how to do photographs, whether you could do color or black and white, how to put a CD in the back. And then a cover artist just sort of fell in our lap who knew what we were doing for some reason. He did a brilliant job. I still work with him on different projects. Wonderful guy. He's gone in his different business. He's maturing his own business thing. We've changed too. And then the day that they were selling the furniture, I'm sure the guys wanted to get me out of there. Right. So I wound up going to a first genealogy conference in Maine, in Portland, Maine. I was one of the DNA companies that I could stand at their booth, and I couldn't stop selling books. I mean, it was like, whoa, I just sold a book. Oh my God. Oh, wow. I sold a second book. And pretty soon I was like a wall of people around me wanting this book. I mean, the ink was still wet on the book, right? So we knew we figured, oh, we'll just sell 10 books and then maybe we'll open another rocket science company. And that's not what happened, because the book, we said, hey, wait, this is a lot more fun than rocket science. No. We'll just sell the book. We'll have fun. We'll go to different conferences. We'll meet a lot of really nice people. We'll solve some puzzles. And then that eventually developed into everything else.
Is that book still available?
It is. You can get it mostly on Amazon. You can write me too if you want. I have a few left. Yeah, you can. It's out there. Forensic genealogy, and it's a hobby book. It's not what we do today with crime. It's how to use little tricks for your genealogy. And as I said, now it's genealogy applied to for science. It
Okay, great.
switched.
When the show's over, I'll get that information and I'll post it in
Okay.
a post for everybody who might be interested in,
Okay.
getting a copy of the book. On the website, I was reading micro array and whole genome sequencing. What
Yeah.
are those things?
Yeah.
I've never seen those before. That doesn't mean anything, of course, but I've never seen those.
Well, okay. Remember how I told you we use 1.2 million points
Mhm.
to do our work? That's how we get the 1.2 million points. And there's two ways you can do that. You can start with a microchip that's already tuned to the right points, and you pour the DNA on the chip and you put it in the microwave, and whatever you do, it comes out, and the data that comes out is the points you need. The other way is to take the whole DNA and make an electronic copy of it. And then once you have the electronic copy, you can do anything you want, right? So somebody comes in called a bioinformatics guy, and he picks out the points we need, only the points we need. So out of maybe 3 billion, he'll come up with 1.2, the million that we need to work. And then that whole genome is available, for other, if you can preserve it forever. You can look at other things if you want to. But if you do it twice, you can add them together. If it's the same person, you can add them together. You can subtract out in some cases if it's a mixture. So it's really nice having that whole genome, because you can do a lot more with it than you can do just with the individual points.
And going forward in the future, how much do you think this is going to change in regards to advances in forensics?
I think it's already changed. It's like been a game changer since 2011, but 2018 really was the boiling point. It's because the besides the issues of data retention and training, as I've certification, as I said, that the frontiers are doing more and more with less and less. I am starting a collaboration with some single cell DNA people. They've been able to get the CODIS, like 75% of the CODIS profile from one cell. So it's becoming more sensitive, the processing. Also, degradation isn't a factor. You could have, that's interesting, because if you have really degraded DNA, it doesn't work with CODIS, because you have pieces of DNA that might be this big and the CODIS markers are this big. But SNPs, you can fit tons of little SNPs on that little piece. So forensic genealogy works a lot better with degraded DNA than CODIS does. So it's more and more with less and less. And also the, rootless hair is a big deal. We can do ancient DNA like we did with Boy in the Box. It's making more use of almost no DNA. We did a case that was 6 cells of the guy's body left. It's like 30 picograms officially is the name, but really it's 5 or 6 cells of the violent offender's body left after the DNA had been used up, and all the trying to improve, every now and then they'll go and redo the DNA to see if better technology, better profile, fingerprinting and everything. But in the end, when we got it, we had 6 cells of the guy's body left and we pulled it off.
I didn't mention this to you before we got on the show, but because some of the things kind of just ring a bell. Are you following the Rex Heuermann Long Island serial killer case?
Yeah,
right? Because
I
a
am.
lot of that, because you mentioned a couple of buzzwords there: degraded DNA, rootless hair follicles, and stuff like that. And that was part of what we had here in New York, the Fry hearing about exactly that kind of stuff. So is that basically what you're talking about in those situations?
That was Ed Green, really pioneer, really great guy. We solved a case with rootless hair from 1948. That was the Somerton man. And I recommend everybody listening to the show go look up the Somerton man and the Tom and Should case, because the man found dead on a beach in Australia in 1948. Never figured out who he was. no tickets in his clothes, took all the labels out, poison, but couldn't detect any poison. Never buried him, but before they buried him, they made a plaster cast of his upper body. And when they did that, they caught hair in the plaster. So 10 years ago, a professor in Australia went with a magnifying glass and a tweezer and got the hair out. And a couple of years ago, we identified him using the hair from 1948.
Amazing. Right. So that Long Island serial killer case is another case that we're following very closely because of the new
Yes.
DNA technology that's been under attack by the defense. But I still think that the judge.
No. He's saying, oh, yeah, you couldn't do that 5 years ago. And now you're telling me you can? Oh, come on. Yeah, come on. You have look at the backup camera on your car. You didn't have that 5 years ago, so we don't have it today, right?
Right.
Come on. That's the way it works.
So yes, yeah, you are a strong believer in this technology and about the identity that goes on with it by finding people, specifically
Yeah,
unidentified human
yeah.
remains.
Yeah, that's just the defense has to do everything they can. But that technology has been used to solve many cases. I'm involved in several others that, let's say they're not solved. We know who it is, but they're not solved. There's a gap between knowing who probably it is and actually the arrest or the admission of the confession. Where, yes. And you have to have that because you can get the snips out of rootless hair, but you can't get the CODIS markers. And that's what they're trying to say in that Fry hearing, is that you don't have CODIS, so you can't do this, right? And they say, yes, we can. We have to make just those snips admissible because there are some cases we'll never have the CODIS markers. And if you depend on that, what you're going to do, let Mr. Heuermann go without really going through the whole trial. You're going to assume you just can't identify him, let him go. So we have to do that. And that's going to be more cases like that where SNPs are admissible instead of CODIS, or with CODIS or instead of CODIS.
Right. Well, in New York kind of puts the problem because they don't take DNA upon arrest. They wait till after conviction. So that becomes another problem. And it's a shortcoming for, I'm sure, in a couple of states for a forensic genealogist when there's less of these samples around.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't matter when Mr. Heuermann, if you take his CODIS, there's no CODIS to compare it to on the crime scenes. It's all rootless hair and SNPs. So, apples and oranges. And that's why they have to get the SNPs accepted so you can do apples and apples.
Oh, okay. See that? I'm glad I brought that up because that's actually an interesting little tidbit there that we weren't going to get into, but I'm glad we did because this is a big case that a lot of people are going to be looking forward to. I mean, he's responsible for 7 and God knows how many other additional cases they're looking at. I mean, they're still. Are you so familiar with the case because they had that Asian male Doe out there? The man found in woman's clothing. They still haven't identified him, but I think they will do that in short order, so to speak.
Do they think he's responsible for that, or is that someone else? I mean, that sounds not his MO.
They haven't said so, and they of course, without evidence, they're not going to say anything.
Yeah, and they have to find out who he is to.
Right. I mean, but it would be a coincidence to have 11 remains found in the same location and not have one person responsible, considering 7 have already been tied to him. So that would be a little interesting tidbit for sure, but we'll find that out.
Yeah,
is
well,
there
it's
anything? I'm sorry.
I said it's kind of suspicious that the 11th body might not belong to him.
Right. Before we go, is there anything specifically that I should have asked you that I didn't, that you thought the audience might be interested in about forensic genealogy?
I think we really did good in covering everything. I would, encourage people. I will say this: there's a lot of opinions about whether public privacy versus public safety. So what I suggest everybody read up on it. Don't just react. I think right at first people were reacting. Oh, don't take oh my God, they're going to get my DNA. No, really sit back, read the issues, really try and understand, read the news. It's a game changer. We're all, NTVIC and the rest of us are trying to make it safe and trying to keep people private. We're trying to make it, so that we go right down the middle. It's useful, and it doesn't invade people's privacy. It doesn't alarm people. So independent of where you fall into that, in that spectrum there, just be informed on what you're making an opinion about. Be able to really say why you believe that, and don't just react. And if you want to give your DNA, you're giving your DNA. And if you don't, the people that we use in those databases for our matches, like I said, the DNA cousins, they've already made half a dozen decisions to be there. They took an ancestry test, they downloaded it, they went to GEDmatch and uploaded it, and they opted in. So there's 4 decisions right there to get from testing with Ancestry to allowing your DNA to be used by law enforcement. So be responsible for that. If you don't want law enforcement to use it, don't put your DNA out there. Stay maybe in Ancestry if you want, if you feel okay about that. It is on the internet. It is evidently secure. They take security very seriously, because that's a big company with a lot of money. It's a leak, it's a problem, it's going to go south. So, I feel okay with Ancestry. But if you go to GEDmatch and it's law enforcement or family tree, you've already made several decisions there. So do it wisely. Do what you want to do. And I would very much like people to trust us and let us upload to GEDmatch, because that means it makes life easier for us. Just a little easier to have more people in there.
Right, exactly. And and I always tell people too, like, oh, I'll never do that. And I said, but there's a possibility when your second or third or fourth cousin has already done it. So your DNA technically is already in the system.
Yeah. It's sort of virtually it is, or part of my DNA. If my cousin's out there, but if you're second cousins to some unidentified human remains, a killer, it doesn't. It's nothing to do with me, and I just assume get them off the street, even if it's my brother, which it isn't. But I don't think anyway. But I'd say, hey, that's fine. Get him off the street. I'm not gonna. Let's do it right.
Exactly. All right, Doctor, this was a fascinating conversation. I tell you, the hour was going to go quick. You hang out with me 1 second. Everybody else, you guys have a great night, and we'll talk to you soon. This Sunday, I have Olivia McCarter. She's 22 years old. She's a forensic genealogist. She's also a crime scene tech, and she actually has her own non-for-profit Moxie Forensics, all by the age of 22. So talk about an inspiration for some of my students out there. Guys, we'll see you soon. Doctor, you hang out 1 second. Everybody have a great night.